There's a lot of talk right now about foreign influence, about China, TikTok, data, and whether America has lost control of its children's attention. But before we jump to blame, I want to slow this down and ask a different question. What if what we're reacting to isn't foreign influence at all, but regret? Regret that systems America built decades ago now work faster, more visibly, and more efficiently than we ever expected. Because the truth is, the United States has a long history of importing labor, data, and infrastructure when it's useful, and then reframing that same access as a threat once dependence becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't new, it's structural, and we've seen it before. In the mid-1800s, Chinese immigrants were actively recruited to build U.S. infrastructure, especially the Transcontinental Railroad. By the 1860s, Chinese workers made up the majority of the Central Pacific Railroad workforce. They performed the most dangerous jobs, blasting tunnels through mountains, laying track in extreme conditions, working where death was common and protection was minimal. They were paid less than white workers and excluded from leadership roles. They were essential, and then they were scapegoated. Once the railroads were completed and economic pressure increased, public sentiment flipped. The narrative shifted quickly. Chinese workers were described as stealing jobs and as a civilizational threat. That shift culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first U.S. law to ban immigration explicitly based on race and nationality. Chinese immigrants were barred from citizenship, families were separated, and violence and expulsions followed across the western United States. The same people who built the infrastructure were later legally excluded from the society they helped to construct. This is the repeating pattern, and it matters. First, labor or capability is needed. A group is welcomed instrumentally, the system stabilizes or stress increases. The group becomes framed as a threat. Fear language replaces gratitude, and policy follows fear. This pattern didn't stop in the 19th century. It reappeared with Japanese Americans during World War II through internment. It resurfaced after 9/11 with Middle Eastern communities under the language of security and surveillance. And today, rhetorically, it appears in conversations about China, technology, data, and artificial intelligence. Different era, same structure. That's why if you hear the phrase, "we must stop all foreign influence," your instinct should be to pause. Historically, that language often collapses into racialized suspicion, even when the underlying issue has nothing to do with people and everything to do with power, data, capital, and control of infrastructure. Just like the railroads, the issue was never Chinese people. It was who controlled labor, money, and expansion. Today, this concern is often framed as an arms race against the Chinese Communist Party, but that framing obscures a deeper contradiction. American power is already built on Chinese manufacturing, African mineral extraction, and globally interdependent supply chains. You cannot disentangle enemy from infrastructure without dismantling the system itself. And that brings us to the present moment. Much of the anxiety around TikTok, data collection, and children's attention doesn't come from a sudden discovery of surveillance. The United States has tracked populations for generations. Long before apps, there were birth certificates, social security numbers, school records, military drafts, tax filings, credit bureaus, and census data. None of this was hidden. It was bureaucratic, slow, and siloed. Tracking people is not new. Tracking people instantly is. For most of history, the system had friction, paperwork, human processing, and institutional lag. Those limitations acted as buffers. Today, algorithms process in real time. Pattern recognition happens faster than law, policy, and culture can respond. So, what feels like a moral crisis is actually a speed mismatch. The system wasn't designed to see itself this clearly, this fast. America doesn't regret collecting data. It regrets losing narrative control over how that data is interpreted. The discomfort isn't that information exists, it's that insight is portable, that behavior can be modeled, that influence no longer stops at borders. The issue isn't surveillance, it's who gets to surveil well. And this is where education enters the picture. Long before algorithms shaped attention, the United States adopted a system designed to shape behavior. In the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, America modeled its public education system on the Prussian education model, a system built to produce disciplined, punctual, obedient citizens for an industrial state. The goal wasn't curiosity, it was compliance. Standardized schedules, bell systems, age-segregated classrooms, memorization over inquiry, testing over wisdom, and obedience over sovereignty. This system predates the Third Reich, but the same educational logic was later intensified under authoritarian regimes. The thorough line isn't ideology, it's administration. Modern states inherited the same industrial governance model: train people to follow instructions, meet external benchmarks, and accept hierarchical evaluation. Then tell them they are free because they can vote between pre-filtered policy options. That's not a contradiction, it's a release valve. Voting provides legitimacy without structural agency, participation without authorship, conflict displacement left versus right instead of system versus structure. This is not unique to America. It's a feature of bureaucratic modernity, which is why TikTok didn't invent mind control. It simply revealed it. Attention was already conditioned by schools, jobs, and television. Algorithms simply made the conditioning visible, faster, and harder to deny. Elites aren't panicking because children are distracted. They're panicking because the conditioning layer escaped national control. That's a power issue, not a moral one. And beneath all of this is an even deeper layer, a misunderstanding about what America actually is. America's political system does not predate ancient Egypt, Greece, or Rome, but it consciously models itself on them symbolically, architecturally, and mythologically. Greek democracy, Roman republican law, Egyptian symbolism of permanence and divine authority. That inheritance is visible on our currency, our monuments, and our capital city. America isn't just a nation state, it's a myth state, a symbolic continuation, and a ritualized republic. Empires don't invent themselves, they simply inherit. Which brings us to culture. With the recent release of the film Sinners, it has been described by some viewers as Marxist, not because of overt political messaging, but because of its use of vampirism as a metaphor for extraction. That metaphor didn't originate in horror cinema. Karl Marx described capital itself as vampiric, dead labor that lives by feeding on living labor. Zora Neale Hurston explored similar imagery through zombification and spiritual drain, people hollowed out by domination, functioning while losing agency. Within that lineage, vampirism isn't racial, it's functional, and anyone placed inside an extractive role can become the vampire. Seen through that lens, the presence of historically exploited labor groups in Sinners, including Chinese Americans, reflects American history, particularly in the South where slavery, sharecropping, convict leasing, and imported labor formed a continuous architecture of extraction. The vampire doesn't represent who someone is. It represents what systems turn people into, which brings everything full circle. Education systems that condition compliance, voting systems that simulate choice, platforms that extract attention, and algorithms that optimize behavior. These aren't separate failures, they're one inheritance. America isn't shocked that people are being tracked. It's shocked that the tracking finally works. And the real question isn't who is to blame, it's how much agency we're willing to reclaim.